Mick Foley is a man who lived and breathed professional wrestling. That was clear from the moment he leapt off his parents' roof as a teenager. Whether he was Mankind, Cactus Jack or Dude Love, Foley gave everything he had to the business, literally going through pain and suffering to entertain the fans. But WWE wasn't where he ended his in-ring career. It was in TNA where he tried to have one last glorious run, but sadly, that run was terrible. The year was 2008 and Mick was a commentator on SmackDown. What should have been a nice, easy job for him was made difficult by Vince McMahon. Vince caused Foley to hate the job thanks to his constant yelling down the headset, and according to Foley himself, one night he just snapped and he screamed in Vince's face backstage that he deserved more respect. And that was the last time that he saw Vince for 3 years, and he got straight on the phone to TNA. It was on a September 2008 episode of Impact where he popped up on the screen with a pre-taped message. It was quite a boring way to introduce Mick to the Impact Zone. His video message interrupted a promo between Kurt Angle and Jeff Jarrett. It was confirmed that Foley would be the special guest enforcer for a match between Angle and Jarrett at Bound for Glory. Foley first appeared in person a couple of weeks later, and he aired his dirty laundry in public by running down Vince McMahon. In fact, Vince's name came up about 5 times, but it has to be said that the fans in the Impact Zone gave Mick a hero's welcome. At the pay-per-view, Foley helped Jarrett get the win over Angle, and then on the next episode of Impact, he said he was done. But we should never trust Mick when he's talking about retiring, because just a week later it turned out that he was actually the co-owner of TNA. Yes, just like that, Foley had bought a stake in the company and was now a major shareholder, thanks to Jeff Jarrett. Around the time of Foley's debut, the main event Mafia came together. Kurt Angle, Kevin Nash, Booker T, Scott Steiner and Sting, they held the belief that as veterans, they deserved all of the top spots in the company. But unlike the main event Mafia, Mick understood the importance of youth, and that's why he teamed up with AJ Styles and Brother Devon to take on Booker, Steiner and Nash at the Genesis pay-per-view. On the night, Kevin Nash was injured, so he was replaced by Billy Gunn of all people. But more surprisingly than that, it was Mick himself who picked up the win for Team TNA. Considering the storyline was that the old guys were holding the young talent down, it would have made more sense for AJ Styles to get the pinfall, considering he was more than 10 years younger. And to be honest, Foley looked terrible here. It should have been a sign to TNA that Mick was better off in a non-wrestling role. From here on out, they sowed the seeds of dissent between Foley and Sting, and as things progressed, it quickly became obvious that we were heading for a Mick Foley vs Sting main event for the title. I loved the feud that they had in WCW back in the day, but I wasn't so keen to see it being redone here in 2009. Bearing in mind that they had young, awesome talent on the roster like AJ Styles, Samoa Joe and Bobby Roode, and yet they still decided to make the age-old mistake of pushing the old-timers instead. Sting was in far better condition than Foley at this point in his career, and he was still capable of having a decent match, but even he couldn't drag Mick across the line here. Foley escaped the cage first to win the TNA World Heavyweight Championship, and the fans were incredibly quiet when he lifted the belt. Him winning the World Heavyweight Championship felt like a big mistake. Foley portrayed himself as being mentally unstable, but by this point we all knew who the real Mick Foley was, so I don't think anyone was really buying into this character. He defended the belt at Sacrifice in a match against Kurt Angle, Sting and Jeff Jarrett. The stipulation was that if Kurt got pinned, he'd lose leadership of the main event Mafia. If Sting got pinned, then he would be forced to retire, and if Jarrett got pinned, then he would lose all of his shares in TNA. And of course, if Mick was pinned, then he would lose the world title. In the end, it was Sting who scored the pinfall. Foley ended up losing the title in a King of the Mountain ladder match at Slammiversary, where Kurt Angle became the new champion. But that didn't stop TNA for booking a main event match at Victory Road, where Foley would attempt to get the title back from Angle. And this match really sucked. Angle was working injured, so not even he could save the day. TNA had introduced an utterly worthless title called the Legends Championship a few months before, which Foley beat Kevin Nash for on an episode of Impact. It's incredible that someone backstage decided to book a rematch between these two at the next pay-per-view and actually thought that it was a good idea. This was two broken down old men bleeding on each other for 10 minutes over a meaningless title. The next chapter in Foley's TNA Odyssey unfolded next when he formed a tag team with Abyss. The Monster and Mick paired up to take on the main event Mafia, but their alliance didn't last long. Foley turned on Abyss and turned heel in the process, all to set up a match between the men at Bound for Glory. But let's just rewind a moment and go over exactly why they split up. Foley had a framed picture of him and Jeremy Borash that he treasured greatly, but on an episode of Impact, Foley discovered that the picture had been torn up and defaced. Foley was growing paranoid at the time, and he accused Abyss of being the one who tore the picture up. This crap was TNA at its worst. It was absolute nonsense. But the Monsters Ball match between the men was actually quite good. They really beat the hell out of each other. 2 weeks later, and Foley turned back babyface. Later, he explained that he'd been testing Abyss all along. You see, because Uncle Mick had a screw loose, we were supposed to just accept this bullshit storyline. However, things were about to change in TNA. Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff were coming. On TV, Mick became paranoid about the Hulkster's intentions, fearful that he would take over part of the company. But in reality, Mick was quite optimistic about Hogan coming in and thought that it was quite a good idea. Through the first few months of 2010, he was involved in storylines with Bischoff, where there was lots of tension between them, with Hogan caught in the middle. This power struggle saw Bischoff humiliating Foley and trying to fire him unsuccessfully. It all led to a no DQ career versus career match against Jeff Jarrett in March, which forced Mick into retirement once again. He was written off TV for several months, and that was probably for the best because tension was starting to brew backstage. Foley's optimism about the Bischoff and Hogan regime had completely worn off as he disagreed with a lot of their booking decisions. He didn't reappear on TV until July 2010, where he led the EV 2.0 invasion. This was TNA's pitiful attempt at cashing in on ECW's memory, as they brought in a load of former ECW wrestlers to feud with Ric Flair's Fortune stable. Everything came to a head when Foley and Flair agreed to face each other in a last man standing match. The idea of these two embarrassing themselves was horrific to me, but the match exceeded expectations. It was probably the most memorable thing that Foley was involved in during his time in TNA. After the match, he disappeared from TV. They did bring him back as a mystery network executive in a storyline that went absolutely nowhere, and then he disappeared again. Foley's frustrations with the company had grown massively, and then he told them that he had no intention of signing a new contract in 2011. The word backstage in TNA was that they were glad to see the back of him because he'd become difficult to work with and he just wasn't towing the company line. You know, after a few days of serious thinking, I can really see how that difficult label could indeed apply to me. I was incredibly critical of the company on Jeff Katz's Geek Week last November, did an interview with the opposition to support my book, forgot to mention the company I worked for on several interviews, took part in a handful of interviews that I was asked politely not to by the company that employed me, and lastly sent out a fairly immature and hurtful tweet comparing my empty arena match with The Rock in 1999 to Impact house shows in terms of attendance. It really was for the best that Foley decided not to renew his contract, and knowing the trajectory of the company over the subsequent few years, he would never have been happy there. His entire run in TNA just felt wrong. It's like he didn't fit. If anything, Foley belongs in WWE. I've never wanted a wrestler that I used to enjoy so much to just go back into retirement as I did during this period of Foley's career. This really was a terrible TNA run for Mick Foley.